Zach, what are your thoughts on, are there any solutions, or are we just going to be continuously talking about the problem and the problem and the problem? What do you see as a solution to the over indebtedness and the garnishee process?
Well, we've got to change our way of thinking to a savings culture, which basically isn't happening at the moment. Nobody's prepared to wait for anything. That's just not the nature of the world at the moment. So can we get people to change their entire way of thinking? It's unlikely. I think that's a huge issue. But another issue that's arisen is perhaps the fact that when people do have garnishee orders, they roll on for years and years and years. And there's no actual acknowledgement of whether the debt is settled or not. So you're getting people who are paying beyond the limit of what the National Credit Act
Yes.
says, Section 1035, called sometimes in duplum by people, whereas those garnishee orders could stop, for instance. They're still carrying on.
There's very little regulation in place. Kim?
I think you touched on some of the issues. One is that a garnishee order does not have an end date on it. The garnishee order merely says that an employer must deduct a certain amount every month until the debt has been paid. And then it usually says plus further interest and costs. So there's no end date on the problem of employers saying we will, the credit provider or the collector instructs us to stop. Now, obviously, there are huge gaps there. Someone mentioned earlier going over the limits of Section 103, get clarification, please, is on that section. Costs include legal fees. There's your biggest Section 103, to use the common law term, is there includes legal fees. So your problem is you can have a capital of 500 Rand and the collector correctly caps the interest at 500, but then charges 6,000 or 7,000 Rand in the fact that, in their opinion, legal fees are not included in Section 103. On what employers can do, etc., we find that employers, at least the last year or two, have started to care. Until a few years ago, generally employers did not really care. Their attitude was, it's your debt, it's not my problem, you got yourself into it, you get yourself out of this. I am merely the administrator. And this I want to tie into Mr. Goodell's statement. I have a court order against me. The sheriff can arrive with a warrant of execution to his truck and sells them to. So I quite like to say, I will just stop paying and you can take me to court. Unfortunately, and this is in the regulatory system, the balance of power sits with the collector or the credit provider. If an employer stops paying, that credit provider can, at the push of a button, have a warrant of execution issued by a sheriff of the court, and the sheriff goes and writes up assets of the employer and loads them.
So what we're saying is that employers don't want to be contradicting the law here either. So they go on and they enforce the garnishee orders. But surely somewhere along the line, employers should also take cognizance of the fact as to when does this end? How long does this go on for? I've heard people who have had garnishee orders go on for over 10 years. And they don't know where the garnishee order is at. They don't know which attorney they are paying. They don't know what their balance owing is. There is so little regulation of this process. Where do we start addressing that problem, the regulation of the garnishee process?
And just to take a step back, employers must really do one of three things. They must continue with an attitude of, I will pay until the collector tells me to stop. Or they must get trained themselves properly to know the law, know what they are entitled to, know how you apply to court for a rescission of a warrant or a rescission of a garnishee order, get to know the credit providers, or they must generally find the large employers, those administrators and auditors of garnishee orders. They outsource this exercise to experts who know the law and who know when and where payments approach court, approach regulators, and really fight for themselves. So that's one decision an employer must take. Am I going to do nothing, or am I going to train my own people, or am I going to outsource